So, welcome to LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I've got about 30 clips on 4 topics for what I think should be a really good show tonight. I'll take the 4 topics in alphabetical order: Ebola, GamerGate, gays, and ISIS. And if you're watching this as a recorded show more than 12 hours after my broadcast, you should have time indexes down in the video description to skip to the different topics. As always, this is my weekly broadcast of the best clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the corporate media here in the United States, along with my commentary between the clips and along with some of those quasi-news political comedy clips I like to add to the mix. This week just from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher from last Friday, because Saturday Night Live was a repeat this week. And as always, I'll be using clips from all the Sunday morning news analysis shows on the regular Big 5 corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News. Plus, I'll have some extra clips from MSNBC, which is an NBC affiliate. As I said at the beginning, I decided to take the topics in alphabetical order, making Ebola first this week, and it's also the biggest topic, taking up about 2/3 of the clips. And I'll start with the way Bill Maher joked about President Obama's recent attempts to calm fears about Ebola in the monologue at the beginning of Real Time with Bill Maher last Friday in this clip.
Now, to try to calm things, the president met with nurses who have taken care of Ebola patients yesterday, and he shook hands with them, he hugged them, he kissed them. What, no twerking? Come on, if we're going to calm nerves, let's put our ass into it, Mr. President. Wow, you thought people were distancing themselves from Obama before. Well, they are.
No, Bill Maher's joking there about people increasing their distance from President Obama because he hugged some nurses, I hope. But in a little unintentional political comedy maybe, over on Fox News Sunday, Chris Wallace actually used President Obama's statement he made when he hugged those nurses as an example of government misstatements, which I don't really get. And you can tell me what you think after you see Chris Wallace's question to Dr. Anthony Fauci from the National Institutes of Health. And I think Dr. Fauci rebutted the false premise of the question pretty well, although not so much regarding President Obama, but a couple of the other examples over in this clip.
Criticisms of the government response so far is that officials, top officials, have said things that turned out afterwards not to be true. Right. Take a look at these.
Okay. I have no doubt that we'll stop this in its tracks in the U.S.
Every hospital in this country has the capability to isolate a patient.
I shook hands with, hugged, and kissed, not the doctors, but a couple of the nurses, and I felt perfectly safe doing so.
Doctor, how do you explain all of these misstatements or overstatements from top government officials?
Well, I'm not so sure, Chris, that they're misstatements and overstatements. When Dr. Frieden said we can stop this in his tracks, he was talking about an outbreak. And what was applied to that was the fact that two more people got it. No, two more people were infected in a situation in which they were at risk. What Dr. Frieden was talking about was an outbreak in the public. Now, we certainly are not happy at all that those 2 nurses were in danger and actually got infected, but that is strictly not an outbreak.
October 3rd, Lisa Monaco says every hospital in the country can isolate a patient. I mean, look, without relitigating each statement, clearly there was a sense of certainty that was being conveyed which has not been lived up to.
Right, exactly. And that's unfortunate. And I think what we need to do right now is to make sure that when we talk about things, that we talk about them, there aren't absolutes. You want to have a delicate balance between assuring the American people, but not scaring them with the fact that there may be a risk. So what we do right now is that nothing is completely risk-free. And that's what people need to understand. But the relative risk of things, what people need to understand, is very, very small. Never zero, Chris, never zero, but very small.
So I guess with that small risk, President Obama didn't really make any misstatement about his confidence in hugging nurses. And, speaking of nurses, I noticed a reference to nurses from Chuck Todd in the intro to NBC's Meet the Press had a kind of unfortunate word choice, as long as I'm trying to find things that are kind of amusing from the shows this morning. It was an unfortunate word choice because both the Texas nurses who got infected with Ebola are actually women of color. And also there's this whole racist undertone to some of the talk about the Ebola threat. Not all of it, obviously, but there is to some of it. And I think Chuck Todd should have made a different word choice because of a close sound-alike word in his introduction to Meet the Press this morning over here.
Meet the Press, our summit on Ebola.
For the first time in the history of the United States, somebody with Ebola walked in the front door.
As 2 nurses come down with the disease, is the wider American public really in danger? And
Now, I know what he asked there was, is the wider American public really in danger? But for some reason, when I heard it, I heard, is the whiter American public really in danger? And I guess it reminded me of that Bill Maher clip I played a few months back where he joked that Americans wouldn't worry about Ebola until it affected countries with white people in them. And I don't know, that actually kind of turned out to be somewhat true. But anyway, having shown a few clips that I thought were amusing in some way about Ebola, which isn't really amusing, I guess I should get to the real news on Ebola, which I'll start by showing an update from ABC's Tom Llamas, reporting on This Week with George Stephanopoulos this morning over in this clip.
George, residents of Dallas woke up this morning to find a mea culpa letter in their local papers. It comes from the CEO of Texas Health Presbyterian, where he acknowledges the hospital did make mistakes. The mea culpa letter comes as a lab technician who handled Ebola victim Thomas Eric Duncan's blood sample returned to Texas on this cruise liner this morning. Earlier, that technician who's been quarantined in her cabin had her own blood sample transferred at sea to conduct tests for Ebola before the ship docked. Watch as a U.S. Coast Guard helicopter hovers over the deck of the Carnival Magic.
The chopper was circling the ship. It never landed. It dropped off the supplies for the blood sample. Came back about 30 minutes later and got the sample, and it was successful.
The air and sea pickup and delivery comes after both Mexico and Belize refused to let that lab technician disembark in their countries. Experts say she was always very low risk. In his weekly address, the president took on the Ebola scares.
This is a serious disease, but we can't give in to hysteria or fear because that only makes it harder to get people the accurate information they need.
In Ohio, though, health officials aren't taking any chances. They're now requiring more than 100 people to self-monitor themselves. This after nurse Amber Vincent flew to Cleveland for wedding planning just days before being diagnosed with Ebola.
Anyone who could possibly have come in contact are going to be contacted and judged on the basis of the risk that they may pose.
Meanwhile, the first 48 people who came into contact with Thomas Eric Duncan will be cleared from monitoring tonight, including his fiancée. So far, none are showing symptoms. And from the hospital where he died, in addition to that mea culpa letter, officials have also begun releasing videos like this one, trying to win the reputation back. ABC News has confirmed that that cruise ship passenger tested negative for Ebola. As for the hospital, doctors and hospital officials acknowledge some patients have canceled appointments in concern over the Ebola scare here.
So, yeah, I think that was a fairly good update from ABC's This Week. Tom Llamas, their reporter, talking about some of the developments, the healthcare workers who are being monitored, the whole cruise ship thing. I guess that guy got back from the cruise ship this morning. But it seems last week when I showed all those clips of these doctors saying that it must have been a breach of protocol, it turns out there were some problems with the protocols. And that's what has really happened. And no one's really gone back and talked about how everyone was saying it was a breach of protocol last week. And it turned out it was a problem with the protocols, although one of the few people who kind of got to the heart of this wasn't a doctor, was the head of one of the nurses' unions. Her name's Jean Ross, and her nurses group is called the National Nurses United. And she talked about how she has some confidence in what the CDC is saying, but then other things they're saying just don't measure up. In one of the most blunt clips I saw on the news shows this morning here.
Ms. Ross, do you have confidence in the CDC?
Yes and no, and I would beg to differ a little bit from what was just said. Yes, you cannot anticipate every possibility, but the nurses and other workers did anticipate what they needed before these errors occurred. We have been saying for months, we realize what it takes. We recognize, we work with Doctors with Borders. We know what is required. We know that the knowledge, the equipment was not being given to us. We have put up with this before. Unfortunately, in this country, we have a profit-driven healthcare system. And you cannot put a price on nurses and other healthcare workers' life. When it comes to the bottom line, that's what hospitals think about. So you have guidelines to follow. They knew what kind of equipment was required, even with the lesser protocols. Our hospitals did not have that. The nurses overwhelmingly told us this in the surveys. We are not ready. So some of this could have been anticipated and should have.
So actually, the one thing, or the thing I like most about that clip is how the nurse ties it into the for-profit hospitals, because one of the things she's saying is that the hospitals knew that they needed better, what they call PPEs, personal protection equipment, but it was too costly to have that all available for a threat that may or may not turn out to exist. And so it wasn't until Ebola made it to the United States that they were like scrambling to update their personal protective equipment and their protocols. And I mean, things were actually not very stringent at the beginning. That's one of the things that came out. And you know, to follow up on what I was saying about the clips from last week, where Dr. Anthony Fauci and from the National Institutes of Health and Dr. Tom Frieden from the Centers for Disease Control were both saying, you know, it must have been a breach in protocol, and now it turns out that there were some problems with the protocols. The closest I got to any sort of investigation of that or admission of that mistake from last week was, you can see this question from Bob Schieffer on, also from CBS's Face the Nation, to Dr. Anthony Fauci, just pointing out that they don't really know where the breach came from, even though they were claiming it last week, although he doesn't mention that they were claiming it last week over in this clip.
Yesterday with the head of the Texas Presbyterian Hospital where this man died, Dr. Richard Vargas, he told me he still does not know how these two nurses became infected with this. But he says the CDC guidelines were, in his words, insufficient. Have they been fixed now with this new set of guidelines to your satisfaction?
So let me explain. I know this sometimes gets confusing. The guidelines that were originally on the CDC were WHO guidelines that worked very well for many, many years in approaching patients who have Ebola in the African setting, which is in a much less well-developed setting, not the tertiary care. Now when you have patients here, we do things that are much more aggressive with patients, intubation, hemodialysis. So the exposure level is a bit different, particularly because you're keeping patients alive because you have the capability. So those guidelines had some aspects about it that we're going to improve on. For example, the guidelines did have some exposure of skin, in the sense you had a mask, but there was some skin that was exposed and some hair that was exposed. That's the thing that now, in our setting of tertiary care, we want to make sure that that's no longer the case, that you have essentially everything covered. So when he says he doesn't know, yes, that's true. We don't know. But we do know that they were in a situation where there was clearly an identifiable potential for how they got infected.
Well, I mean, that's the part that, as a layman, that kind of bothers me, that all this time has passed and they basically, what he says, they don't have a clue.
Well, again, I don't want to be...
That's my word, not his.
There's no definite, because you can't say that she definitely got infected here, because remember, she went from a less stringent to a more stringent protocol. She was not only on the original protocol. As soon as they found out that this person was positive by the lab test, then they switched over to a much more stringent protocol. So he's right that you don't know if she's infected here or she's infected in the more stringent protocol. But I think common sense would tell you that it's much more likely that you get infected when there's skin exposed as opposed to when there's not skin exposed.
So that last part kind of makes sense, but you can see Dr. Anthony Fauci this week kind of admitting that there was a time when they upgraded the protocol, and so people even under the old protocol or the original protocol wasn't really that stringent, and so it wasn't a breach in protocol necessarily that caused the infection of this nurse. It could easily have been a flaw in the protocol itself, which is something they didn't seem willing to admit last week. And here's an additional clip from that same interview on CBS's Face the Nation between Bob Schieffer and Dr. Anthony Fauci from the National Institutes of Health, where Bob Schieffer asked him if the CDC is about to put out new protocols or new guidelines, and he kind of admits that they are going to put out new guidelines, because these old ones are the way they dealt with it in Africa in non-hospital situations, supposedly, kind of what he said before over in this clip.
We keep hearing reports that the CDC is about to issue some new guidelines here. Right. Can you tell us anything about that?
I don't want to preempt the issuing of them, Bob, but we've been working with a set of guidelines that have been modeled after what has been done for many years by WHO, that we want to make sure we go a step further with that. I can tell you what we do today at my institution is predicated on no skin exposed, good training, having somebody monitor you back and forth to make sure you put your garb on and you take it off. Well, that's what we do. Don't want to officially comment on what's being developed, but pretty soon we're going to be seeing new guidelines that at least I can tell you they're going to be much more stringent than the previous.
Much more stringent.
Yeah.
So that seems to be pretty much an admission to me that there were problems with the protocols, that last week they were saying the protocols must have been breached for people to get infected. Now the same people, without ever retracting the untrue statements from last week, or putting out this new set. I mean, in a way, as a scientist, I guess it makes sense to be open to a change in the evidence, to change your protocols. I'm not criticizing that, but it seems to be that there's not a lot of admission about all those certainties they said last week. And I'm kind of surprised that no one on any of the Sunday morning shows really brought that up. Now, the other big development, or one of the other developments this week in Ebola, was the appointment by President Obama of a Ebola czar, if that's what you want to call it, someone who is in charge of managing Ebola. And the person he picked, Ron Klain, is a former chief of staff to two vice presidents, Gore and Biden, but is not a doctor, doesn't have any real medical expertise. And you can see that Marsha Blackburn, this Republican from the House of Representatives, who I think may be the new Michelle Bachmann, maybe like a mini Sarah Palin, or one of the people who says kind of crazy things and factually incorrect things. I think she may be, because Michelle Bachmann's leaving the House at the end of this term, so I think Marsha Blackburn may be the new crazy right-wing woman who appears on the talk shows. And she doesn't say anything too crazy in this clip, but you can see that Bob Schieffer asks her about why Republicans were calling for the appointment of an Ebola czar, and then when President Obama appointed him, then they criticized the appointment. And you can see her explanation in her answer to Bob Schieffer's question over in this clip.
Well, Congresswoman, the Republicans all wanted a czar appointed, and then the president appointed one, and now you don't like it. So why is that?
Well, Bob, I think that what we were hopeful was that we were going to have someone who had the experience, not only from the medical community, but in emergency response, that would be out there and help walk not only our nation, but the entire globe through this process. General Honore or former Senator Bill Frist would have been a much more appropriate type of appointee to address this. I don't know Ron Klain's emergency response experience. Maybe the Bush-Gore recount qualified in that. And I think talking to constituents, so many people have said, we didn't want somebody to give us spin. We want somebody to give us the facts. And that's what they were hopeful for.
Let me just...
I think there was a little bit of partisanship in that response, the whole Bush v. Gore thing, and I don't necessarily think that the person has to have medical expertise. And as sort of a rebuttal to that answer from Representative Marsha Blackburn, I want to show George Stephanopoulos asked Dr. Anthony Fauci about this issue over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. And Dr. Anthony Fauci, who again is from the National Institutes of Health, I think he's actually from the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases over at the National Institutes of Health, and he pretty much endorsed the Obama pick of Ron Klain over in this clip.
The president's new Ebola czar, Ron Klain, also coming under some criticism. People concerned that he doesn't have a background in medicine or in infectious disease, coming from Republicans on Capitol Hill and others. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that's a misplaced criticism. What we're talking about now is an Ebola response coordinator, somebody who has extraordinary, as he does, managerial experience, the ability to be, leadership experience, which he has plenty of. He's going to rely on medical experts like myself and Dr. Frieden and others to do the medical thing. So we welcome that. Lisa Monaco and Susan Rice have been doing that, but they have other big jobs to do. They've been doing a terrific job, but they have other responsibilities. We're talking about one designated person who's an excellent manager.
So that's one political issue, the appointment of this Ebola czar, Ron Klain, with, you can see Representative Marsha Blackburn as the Tea Party Republican attacking the Obama administration for picking a political person rather than a medical person, and you can draw your own conclusion about that. And then Dr. Anthony Fauci's rebuttal, and so between the two of them you can draw your own conclusion. The other huge political issue, and this is getting into the political campaigns, I chose not to show you any clips from the actual senatorial campaigns and other campaigns around the country that were on the morning shows, where especially Republican candidates were using fears about Ebola and the bad response of the Obama administration. And of course the big issue they're using is that President Obama hasn't instituted a travel ban. He hasn't stopped people coming from West Africa to the United States. And so that was a big issue on the Sunday morning shows. And having shown the Tea Party Republican from the House of Representatives, Representative Marsha Blackburn, in that previous clip, now I will show you one of the Tea Party leaders from the Senate, Republican Ted Cruz, who was very harsh on the Obama administration and his criticism of the lack of a travel ban. And he said it was all political, that all the doctors who say that that a travel ban will actually hurt more than it will help are actually, mouthpieces for the Obama administration, which by the end of this I'm going to definitely show is not true. But here's the beginning of Ted Cruz making that argument over on CNN State of the Union this morning, talking to Candy Crowley over here.
Well, look, there were no doubts mistakes that were made up and down the line at the level of the hospital, at the level of the health officials implementing the protocols. But I'll tell you, the biggest mistake that continues to be made is now, more than 2 weeks into this, we continue to allow open commercial air flights from countries that have been stricken by Ebola. That doesn't make any sense. We've got upwards of 150 people a day coming from countries with live active Ebola outbreaks. For over 2 weeks, I've been calling on the administration to take the common sense stand of suspending commercial air travel out of these countries until we get the air travel under control. And for whatever reason, the Obama White House doesn't want to do so.
What must
For whatever reason, being, of course, that all the medical experts are telling the Obama administration that it would hurt more than it would help. And Candy Crowley actually confronts Senator Ted Cruz with a clip from Dr. Tom Frieden, who's the head of the Centers for Disease Control. And you can see how Senator Ted Cruz responds to that over in this clip.
Perhaps it is because the voices in the medical community, particularly Dr. Frieden has been one of them out there saying that this would be counterproductive. I want to play you a little bit of what Dr. Frieden had to say about a travel ban.
Sure.
Right now, we know who's coming in. If we try to eliminate travel, the possibility that some will travel overland, will come from other places, and we don't know that they're coming in, will mean that we won't be able to do multiple things. We won't be able to check them for fever when they leave. We won't be able to check them for fever when they arrive. We won't be able, as we do currently, to take a detailed history to see if they were exposed when they arrive.
So if you will just respond to that and his concern, listen, we won't be able to track these people because they will come in other places and we won't know that they're entering the U.S.
Well, Candy, the administration has given two arguments against a flight ban, neither of which makes sense. The first one, they say, is they're putting screening in place. The argument you just played, that they've got screening in place in 5 airports, and then that should be our line of defense. Now, I would note that they have omitted airports like DFW, where Mr. Duncan came. But more importantly, the screens only work if a passenger is demonstrating symptoms. Ebola, unfortunately, has up to a 21-day incubation period where the patient has no demonstrated symptoms and walks right through the screenings. Mr. Duncan, the one patient we know who did come from Liberia to America, would have traveled right through the screenings. The screening would not have stopped him because he was not presenting symptoms at that time.
So far, Senator Ted Cruz is, he hasn't gone totally off the rails, but you'll see in the final part of his argument that I'm going to show you from CNN's State of the Union with Candy Crowley, he does pretty much go off the rails. He accuses all the doctors of, like I said, or like I showed, of being mouthpieces, and then he goes into this whole rant about how it could be a terrible immigration problem in our southern border, and if Ebola gets to Central America, well, whatever. I'll talk about it a little more after I show you that clip. Let's see, that's clip number 12.
Let me ask you a couple things as regards Mr. Duncan. He did indeed come to the U.S. from Liberia, but he went from Liberia to Brussels to Dulles International in Virginia to Dallas-Fort Worth. So how does a ban on air travel stop Mr. Duncan?
Because the visa he had coming in was a travel visa from Liberia. We should stop issuing travel visas from Liberia, which, interestingly enough, the neighboring countries in Africa have done. What we need from the president is serious leadership to protect the American people. This shouldn't be a partisan issue. We should be protecting citizens of this country.
Understood. But again, the experts are telling the president's not a doctor. And if you were president and NIH or the CDC were saying, hey, this will only make it worse. A travel ban, a flight ban will only make it worse. What we have in place is better. You would overrule the doctors and the experts?
Their arguments, Candy, the doctors and the experts that are saying this are working for the administration and repeating the administration talking points, and their arguments don't make sense. The first argument about the screens doesn't make sense because they don't work during the 21-day incubation period. And the second argument that they make is they say a travel ban would prevent healthcare relief workers from arriving in West Africa. No one is talking about banning flights into West Africa. Of course, physicians and nurses and healthcare workers should be allowed to go in there, and we can send them in on charter flights or military C-130 aircraft with appropriate safety precautions. That's very different from saying commercial airliners should fly day after day after day with hundreds of passengers connecting with thousands of passengers coming all throughout the country. The arguments they're giving don't make sense, and what is unfortunate is watching the Obama administration treat this as yet another political issue rather than as a public health crisis. For the same reason, you've seen virtually no attention from the administration on the need to secure the southern border. Now, that is notwithstanding the fact that General John Kelly, the commander of the Southern Command, just a week ago said if Ebola is transmitted to Central or South America, we will see a mass migration, the like of which we have never seen. And the administration, unfortunately, is not acting to protect our southern borders or to restrict commercial airline flights from places with an active outbreak. And that just doesn't make sense.
There's so much wrong with that. I could spend the whole rest of the show probably deconstructing the mistakes in there, but I don't really have time for that. But I do want to show that CNN's Candy Crowley had Dr. Anthony Fauci on after she had on Senator Ted Cruz, and she emphasized that one point he made about all the doctors who are saying it would be counterproductive to put on this travel ban are working for the administration, and she asked Dr. and she said that was not very well. You can see in her intro to talking to Dr. Anthony Fauci, she put a little bit of a negative spin on that claim by Senator Ted Cruz, because I don't think it is actually a really legitimate claim. And then she asked Dr. Anthony Fauci about it over in this clip.
The interview you just heard, Senator Ted Cruz says, in effect, never mind the doctors who were advising President Obama against ordering a travel ban because of Ebola, because those same doctors work for the president. With me now, one of those doctors, Anthony Fauci, longtime director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Like it or not, we're in a political time, 2 weeks from a midterm, and the feeling, at least expressed by Ted Cruz, that the travel ban is absolutely necessary, makes total sense, but that doctors don't want to tell the president that because he is against a travel ban.
That's just not the case. I've never had an experience where the president is telling me to tell him something that he wants to hear. The president and the health officials, Sylvia Burwell and others, ask you what your opinion is. No pressure. None at all. I mean, they just ask, what is your opinion about this? And that's the reason why we give the opinion. We respect the opposing opinion, but what was just articulated by Senator Cruz, the fact is it would be very, very difficult if you lost control of easily tracking people. You got to look at the numbers to look about how many people are really trying to get into the country. 36,000 people in 2 months went to airports to get out of those 3 countries. 77 were blocked because of a health issue. When they investigated them, none of them had Ebola. A lot of them had malaria. So there's not a lot of people trying to get into the country. So that's the thing that needs to be understood.
I guess.
So that at least partially rebuts what Senator Ted Cruz was talking about. And you can see Dr. Anthony Fauci make some of that same argument and then a little bit of a different argument when he was over on Fox News Sunday. But, of course, Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday tries to support the argument from the Republicans a little more about the need for a travel ban and really confronts Dr. Anthony Fauci why there isn't a travel ban or why he's not recommending one over in this Fox News Sunday clip here.
You were here just 2 weeks ago. You flatly opposed a travel ban from the 3 West African countries, the hot zone, up there on the map. But now more than 24 African countries have restricted travel from those countries, and so have a number of European airlines. Are we here in the U.S. being just politically correct at allowing people to continue to travel in?
I don't think so, Chris. I think when you talk about the idea of a travel ban, we listen to and respect the opinions of people who feel that should be the case. Because their argument, it's an argument from people who are of good intention. They want to do the best for the American people. There are some downsides to that.
What's the strongest argument against a travel ban?
Well, the strongest argument, I believe, against it is that when people are coming into the country, you know exactly, you can track them. If you say nobody comes from Sierra Leone, Liberia, or Guinea, there are so many other ways to get into the country. You can go to one or the other of the other countries and then get back in. So when they come in from a place that you can track them, you know.
But just briefly,
yes.
I mean, they're going to have a passport from that country. They're going to have a stamp from that country.
Right.
Couldn't you still screen them? And I mean, and I hear this talk about, well, we're going to disrupt the democracies, the economies of this country. We're talking about 100 to 150 people each day. Is this really going to cause that much disruption to try to do what a lot of countries in Africa are now doing?
Yeah, okay, but take it from the other side, Chris. If you look at the August and September, 36,000 people came to an airport in one of those 3 countries to get out. By the screening there, 77 were not allowed to get on the plane for health reasons. Of those 77, none had Ebola. So there is not a big influx of people trying to get in the country. So you got to look at the possible downsides of trying to just completely not let anybody out when there isn't not only not a large number, 0 of the 77 that were stopped actually had Ebola. Most of them had malaria.
So anyway, you can see that answer from Dr. Anthony Fauci on Fox News Sunday was pretty similar to the one I showed before from CNN State of the Union in his response to what Senator Ted Cruz had said. And, Dr. Anthony Fauci was on several of the programs, and I tried not to get too much duplication, but I just wanted to show the difference between the way the travel ban was treated on CNN State of the Union versus Fox News Sunday, where they kind of supported it. And then one of the most interesting things about the Fox News Sunday coverage was they provided one of the best rebuttals to that claim from Senator Ted Cruz that it's only doctors who work for the Obama administration who are saying there shouldn't be a travel ban, because Fox News Sunday could have found any doctor. You know, they not only had the government doctor, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who, I mean, he doesn't really work for President Obama, but he is kind of a spokesperson for the administration at this point because he's, you know, working in the group who are responding to the Ebola problem. But over on Fox News Sunday, they had this doctor who's actually a critic of the Obama administration, and he wouldn't say that a travel ban was a good idea, and he said a lot of the same things that Dr. Anthony Fauci said, even though he was paired with this Republican congressperson, Representative Tim Murphy, and I'm going to show a clip of both of them. First, you'll see this doctor from, I can't remember, some university in Minnesota, I think. His name is Michael Osterholm, and even though he's a critic of the Obama administration, he also won't say that a travel ban is a good idea. Followed by Tim Murphy, the Republican, still saying a travel ban's a good idea. Damn the doctor's opinions, whatever, over in this clip.
Mr. Osterholm, because as I discussed with Dr. Fauci, the fact is that a number, I think 24 African nations have restricted travel from the so-called hot zone, which raises the question, should we?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. Just because somebody takes an action doesn't mean it's right. I believe that Congressman Murphy is well-intended in his assessment here, and surely it makes some sense. But we've actually looked at this issue quite closely over the years, and you've already led this program with saying that I've been critical of our response, and I am, about how slow we have been to respond in Africa. I would have no problem saying that the thing to do is close the border if we could really protect this country from what's happening over there. That's just not the case. And this is not a partisan issue, and it shouldn't be a partisan issue. Just this past week, former Secretary Mike Leavitt of HHS under the Bush administration, somebody I very much respect and admire, himself came out and said from his own experience, having been at HHS and reviewing
But Mr.
all the
Osterholm,
information available,
why is a travel ban a bad idea?
Well, the travel ban is a bad idea in part because of the fact that we really don't effectively stop people from getting into this country. And for what? I mean, and what I'm talking about here is we've had one single case so far in the big picture of what the situation is. Maybe we stop another one and two more. But we do know that travel bans will seriously impact our ability to get people in and out of that area. And Congressman, with all due respect, I agree with you on the Berlin airlift. But that was all military. If you're prepared today to give us hundreds of military planes that will fly in and out at will when we need them to move not only material but also people, when we move them around, then I'll say, well, maybe we ought to reconsider this. But I don't see anybody in Congress telling us today that we're going to get hundreds of military planes.
Congressman Murphy?
Well, I've already asked Dr. Frieden and sent a letter to President Obama saying, tell us whatever Congress needs to authorize. We're sending thousands of troops over there through ships, through also planes. We could do a lot here. I mean, the ability of the U.S. military to move goods and supplies is pretty massive. We all want to stop Ebola in Africa, but we also don't want it to come here. And even if people talk about, well, one more case, you know, it means a lot to the family of someone who dies in the United States, and it means a lot to the safety and security of Americans. And so let's focus on concentrating our efforts to stop it in Africa, but let's also make sure that we're protecting America's borders from it coming in here too.
All right.
So I don't know about you, but I think I'm going to believe the doctors more than I'm going to believe the politicians. And I think it's kind of interesting that Fox News Sunday there, by picking that doctor from Minnesota who's a critic of the Obama administration, Dr. Michael, what's his name, Osterholm, something like that, that even he was against the travel ban. So I thought that was interesting coverage on Fox News Sunday, you know, that it actually was a little bit fair and balanced there for a minute. And I thought over on NBC's Meet the Press, they actually did a pretty good job of balancing. They had two different senators, one for the travel ban, Republican Roy Blunt from Missouri, and then Senator Bob Casey from Pennsylvania was opposed to the travel ban. First I'll show Missouri Senator Roy Blunt on NBC's Meet the Press talking to Chuck Todd in this clip.
Welcome to both of you. Senator Blunt, I want to begin with you. You're calling for a travel ban. There's a lot of, it sounds like the White House in theory would be supportive of it, but they don't know how to implement it in a way that would prevent healthcare workers from getting to the hot zone. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, we don't have flights directly in and out of any of these countries, so all of our people go through some other country to get there anyway. The question is, do you let people come here from this area that is clearly stressed? And one way to prevent that is just not to issue them a visa. Everybody that would travel here from those countries, no matter where they get to first, before they get off the plane here, they have to have a visa that allows them to stay here. I'd suspend those visas until we have this under better control and have a sense that the carriers they are using are monitoring this in a better way than they have been up till now.
So that's, like I said, Senator Roy Blunt from Missouri coming out in favor of the travel ban. And, I like what the Democrats are saying, listen to the medical experts. That seems like a much more reasonable position, a pro-science position. And you can see Senator Bob Casey from Pennsylvania make that argument over on NBC's Meet the Press this morning, talking to Chuck Todd here.
Chuck, I don't think there's a medical consensus yet, and I think we've got to do everything we can to ask the medical experts and develop that expertise.
Sometimes a fine line here, right? Is it, if it makes, do you think sometimes you have to do things because it makes the public feel better, even if it's not necessary?
There's no question that there's a great fervor for this, and it makes sense logically when you think about how to stop something. But we've got to focus, I think, on the source of this. You heard in your last segment how severe this is at the source. We've got to stop it at the source. I think with our local hospitals, not just the big medical centers, but every hospital has to try to achieve a measure of almost absolute preparedness. That's why a lot of them are changing. I was at a hospital in Pittsburgh the other day, changing and moving quickly to implement better protective protocols.
You both have toured hospitals.
So anyway, that was the coverage on the travel ban on NBC's Meet the Press with Chuck Todd talking to the two senators from Missouri and Pennsylvania. I want to show a couple more quick clips on Ebola before I get to the GamerGate topic. And these clips are on what should be the really big story of the Ebola epidemic, or the Ebola problem in the world, which is what's going on in West Africa. Most of those clips I showed you are about what's going on in the United States. It's kind of a testament to the way the corporate media here in the United States is really focused on what's happening to people who are Americans. I've shown that in so many different clips over my many shows, and I do want to at least show that there was a little focus on what's going on in Africa. First, from NBC's Meet the Press, they had this doctor from the United Nations, World Health Organization, I think he's from. Chuck Todd asked if they were unprepared for the Ebola outbreak, and you get the answer that actually the world was unprepared. This is Dr. Anthony Banbury, I believe his name is, talking to Chuck Todd on NBC's Meet the Press this morning here.
Was the WHO unprepared? I mean, I know that you guys are doing the WHO is doing sort of a looking back and going to look to see what happened, what did they miss, what part of this could they have dealt with earlier? And I know there will be after action reports, but what part of this were you unprepared for?
The world was not prepared for an outbreak of Ebola like this nature. We had never seen it before, spreading in wide geographical areas, spreading in urban settings, densely populated urban settings. In addition, the social patterns and travel movements in West Africa are very different than in East and Central Africa. So the previous outbreaks had all been small and localized. Here, it spread real fast. The world wasn't prepared. UN, governments, the populations, and now we're catching up.
So yeah, that was Dr. Anthony Banbury from the United Nations talking about everyone, the whole world being unprepared for the Ebola outbreak. And then the last clip I want to show you, it's almost 4 minutes long, I think. It's from CBS's Face the Nation. It's a report from Debora. Let me make sure I dropped this clip list here. It's a report from Debora Patta. I showed a clip from her last week. She's been in Monrovia, Liberia, and this is the last report that she filed on what's going on there. And there's a lot of good information in there, but if I were to give any criticism of it, I would say that it approaches it almost like a human interest story. It's really focused on the human drama. And I'm not going to show the clip that immediately followed this, but Bob Schieffer, like right after they showed this clip, said every time I see that clip, it like gets me choked up. And it is kind of a really emotion, or it's supposed to tug at your heartstrings, I think. But buried in about the center of this 4-minute clip is the information that the World Health Organization is predicting that by the end of this year, there may be 10,000 new cases of Ebola every week in West Africa. And it seems to me she should have spent more time on that, and maybe a little less time on the human interest part of it, although I'm not going to say it's a completely bad report. There's a lot good to it as well, but you can tell me what you think after you watch it. It's like 4 minutes long over here.
The organization reported Friday that Ebola has now killed at least 4,555 people, but experts say that number is likely to go much higher. CBS News reporter Debora Patta spent 6 days in Monrovia, Liberia last week. She filed this report about her experience there.
You really get a sense in Liberia that for a country only recently emerging from civil war, this Ebola virus has just been devastating. The minute you land in the capital, Monrovia, you're on your guard. Washing your hands with chlorine before you enter public places is mandatory, as are the regular temperature checks. The already dysfunctional health system is broken under the strain, and as hundreds of infections turned to thousands, there were simply not enough beds to house the sick. A quick walk around the capital made it abundantly clear there is virtually no infrastructure to speak of in Liberia. That's where the United States and other nations started shouldering some of the burden, as we saw when we visited General Darryl Willaims at his beachfront headquarters.
The U.S. military is not here to solve Ebola. The CDC, AID, the leaderships provided, the government library, the U.S. Embassy here, all the folks that I mentioned, that team of teams is what's going to help stop Ebola, or contribute to stopping Ebola.
But the passionately dedicated Doctors Without Borders rightly points out that building new treatment centres is not enough. Who they ask will staff them. Care for Ebola patients takes long hours of training, and they've been persistently sounding the alarm for the last 8 months now, but this has largely been ignored. Perhaps the latest dire predictions from the World Health Organization of 10,000 new infections every week by the end of the year, unless more is done, will be the final tipping point. Of course, like any story of misery and suffering, there are always incredible heroes. I have a profound new respect for health workers working in brutal conditions in those stifling, claustrophobic protective suits. Like the world-renowned virologist, Dr. Dan Lucey, we caught up with him on a good day. A family of 3 he thought wouldn't make it had walked out of the treatment center Ebola-free.
Now, today, it's one of the best days of my life because they're survived.
It takes quite an emotional toll, doesn't it?
But it's worth it. So I'm happy to be here.
And of course, there are the ordinary Liberians doing extraordinary things to help their country. Some of them have the most dangerous jobs in the world, yet they show up day in and day out. Like this ambulance team who were called out on yet another run into the West Point slum to fetch a man showing symptoms of Ebola. As they race through the warren of narrow alleys, you are reminded of just how contagious this virus is and how one wrong move could be fatal. The man was placed in an ambulance heading off for a treatment unit. He continues to struggle for his life. Those who are lucky enough to survive are often shunned by their community. There is still a lot of stigma attached to Ebola. Health workers risk their lives every day. We met Diana Sarte, an Ebola nurse at Monrovia's JFK Hospital. Every morning she prays with her children before heading off to treat her patients.
Even though it's dangerous, but I took oath to save lives.
And it is her children that are on her mind as she suits up in a double layer of protective gear. She's extra careful, knowing that exhaustion and carelessness could be fatal. And yet she is back again the next day. This kind of dedication was truly inspiring to witness. And good to know there are people like Diana Sarte, as Ebola is a deeply dehumanizing disease where the sick and dying are even deprived of a loving human touch. As correspondents, we are used to covering war zones, which carry their own unique risks. But this battle zone was an assignment like no other. Here, the and invisible, you don't know when it could attack. And whilst in war zones, the danger recedes when you leave. Here, with Ebola, the danger could still be carried within you.
So yeah, I think that was a really good report in that it showed the human, the human factor, the human cost, the human toll, and brought it down to individuals so you could really see how it was affecting real people. And so in that way it was a good report. But I mean, talk about burying the lead. Like I said, almost exactly at the 2-minute mark, within like 15 seconds of the 2-minute mark, she put in that part about the WHO predicting 10,000 new infections a week by the end of this year. And I heard another journalist on another show talking about how Americans could be sitting down to Thanksgiving hearing about 100,000 infections in West Africa, and by Christmas 300,000. It's still growing at a geometric, one of the jokes I didn't show from Bill Maher on HBO's Real Time, he talked about how Ebola makes him nostalgic because it's something that is going viral, and it's actually a virus going viral. So it's like the old style of something going viral, but this is how viruses go viral, where every person who gets infected infects at least 2 more people before they, get treated or die, or, it's kind of a nasty situation. And so I don't think the Ebola story in Africa is over by any means. It is definitely still out of control there. But on the other hand, I think the Ebola story in the United States has still been a little bit overcovered and overhyped as something to be afraid of, even though some of the assurances we heard from people like Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Tom Frieden about how this nurse must have been infected because she breached the protocol last week turned out to be, no, actually there were some problems with the protocols, and it wasn't really the nurses. So I'm glad that at least the truth came out, even though no one seemed to retract the untruths from last Sunday. Anyway, those are the clips I want to show you about Ebola. And coming up next, in alphabetical order, of course, is GamerGate, which, having covered Islam for a couple shows for the last couple weeks, which has really divided my audience. I know this GamerGate thing is also going to be kind of divisive, because I have viewers who, come from some of my YouTube friends like Thunderfoot and the Amazing Atheist, both of whom I like and whose videos I enjoy watching. And Thunderfoot I've actually met in person. And then I also have people who are more fans of, say, Lacey Green, whose videos I also enjoy, and who is another person who I've met in person, who I actually got to know through several meetings through work we did together for the ACLU. So I know this is going to be kind of controversial with my audience, and I actually think I kind of take a centrist position on the whole GamerGate issue. I've been reading your comments. People started arguing about GamerGate down in the comments section before I even started the broadcast. So I know this is a really divisive issue, and people are wondering how I'm going to come down on it. But before I get to that, I want to start off by showing you the introductory clip that they showed on MSNBC's show, Melissa Harris Perry. I actually watch that show every now and then when I have time. It's not one of the shows I regularly cover on my LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup, but I noticed Anita Sarkeesian was on the show this morning, so I thought it might be interesting to take a few clips from that. And the first clip I want to show you it's another long clip. It's 2 or 3 minutes long, and it's Melissa Harris Perry giving sort of a history of video gaming and sexism in video gaming, which in some ways I think the things she says are true. It's a little bit one-sided, which I'll discuss after I show you that clip over here.
Pong. Created in 1969, it was the first popular video game many people ever saw. Heralded as a milestone, this primitive little game helped launch a multi-billion-dollar industry. Today, technology allows for stunningly realistic images and allows the millions of gamers around the globe to enter complex worlds with engaging narratives and characters. We think of this as technological progress. There are also parts of these extraordinary new games that have me yearning for the simplicity of Pong. Now, I want to warn you, I'm about to show some images that can be disturbing and that are not suitable for the youngest Nerdland viewers. So take a look behind me. These images are all from popular video games played by millions of people, and they feature women in troubling, violent, and dehumanizing ways. In this scene, a group of men howl and cheer a scantily clad stripper in Hitman Absolution. Here, a woman is repeatedly slapped in the game Far Cry 3. Here, a woman lays dead and apparently irrelevant in this image from Mafia 2, Joe's Adventures. The games are fantasy, but the threat of violence, all too real for one woman who dared to say enough. When she spoke out against these representations of women, she received death threats in return. And we're going to talk to her about what the story of GamerGate is all about. Next.
So that was the introductory segment before the commercial, before Melissa Harris Perry interviewed Anita Sarkeesian. And, you know, I'm of two different minds on that introduction. I mean, I'm someone who was actually old enough to remember Pong. Back when Pong came out, I was still in preschool, I guess, or before first grade anyway, I think. And but I do remember Pong back when it was pretty popular, that you would see it in places like embedded down in the table, or you could play Pong. And I'm not someone who's going to say there isn't sexism in video games. I'm sorry if that's going to disappoint some people, but as someone who played the game Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards back on my Apple II when I was in high school, I mean, there's so many different sexist tropes in video games. But on the other hand, saying that there's sexism in video games to me is like saying there's sexism in popular studio films that come out of Hollywood. I mean, of course there's sexism in them. There's sexism in society as well. But I mean, that part I don't have a lot of problems with it. Anita Sarkeesian posits in some of her videos, although I don't know how well her videos are actually sourced. She seems more like a pop sociologist than a real academic, from what I've seen of the academic rigor of her work. But what she's saying about sexism in video games or even in society, I don't have a lot of problems with the connection she makes between the sexism in some video games and sexism in society. I think it goes the opposite way. I think that video games and films reflect the sexism that's already in society, and not all video games and films are sexist, but there's certainly some tropes that are, and there's some that aren't, and you can find them if you look for them. So I think there is some cherry picking, but I'm not going to be someone who denies the sexism in society. But before I get to her clip about the sexism causing sexism in society, when I think, which is actually the opposite of what I believe, I do want to show one clip of Melissa Harris Perry's interview with Anita Sarkeesian, where she asked her about this specific threat at this Utah university. And I actually thought that Melissa Harris Perry did a good job of putting it in context of all the threats that she gets as a broadcast personality, and asked her specifically, why did she take this threat seriously? And you can see Anita Sarkeesian's answer to that over in this clip.
And the decision to cancel the talk. I really want people to understand just the extent of this threat. I get rape threats online. We see the kind of horrible things that women get. But for the most part, you can sort of say, well, this is horrifying, but it's social media, and then you move forward. But you made a decision to cancel this talk because you took these threats very seriously. Why in this case?
I do, and I take all the threats that I receive very seriously. This was the first time I canceled an event due to threats. And part of the reason, or actually the reason why I canceled was when I spoke to the police that was responsible for increasing security at the event, I asked them about Utah's concealed gun laws and if they could screen for weapons. Now, to be clear, the threat that was received was about a massive school, like a massacre, right? A school shooting. So I asked them what they were going to do to screen for weapons and firearms, and they said that they couldn't do anything. I requested pat-downs or metal detectors, and they said no. So they wouldn't even check for permits to see if people, were permitted to have firearms on them. And I think that this is ludicrous to put me and the students' safety at risk when there's literally a threat about a school shooting with firearms.
So that's Anita Sarkeesian's answer. And, I've watched a couple recent videos by The Amazing Atheist where he compared her reaction to the reaction of Marilyn Manson when there was a bomb threat at one of his concerts, although I don't know whether Marilyn Manson had any control over the security measures that were taken at that concert, so that would be a question I'd have about that analogy. And then I also saw one by Thunderfoot where he was questioning whether the threat was serious and showed some quotes from law enforcement officers saying that, they were taking all measures necessary and they didn't see any need for any additional measures because it wasn't a serious threat, or and the thing is, if someone wants to react to a threat like that, I don't think that should be the thrust of anyone's argument against them. Some people are more sensitive to those kind of threats than others, and if someone doesn't feel safe, I think you should give them some leeway. And I haven't watched the entire Thunderfoot series on Anita Sarkeesian, but I've seen some of them, and some of his I agree with some of his counter arguments to her claims about sexism in video games, and others I don't think are that good from Thunderfoot. But overall, I think that his arguments are much too personal, and that I don't know why he seems really angry at Anita Sarkeesian, and I mean over all of Thunderfoot's videos, I know he's gotten he gets more emotional, even though he's a scientist. He gets more personal and is more willing to use harsh language and personal attacks on Christians and other people who he makes videos, and Muslims, of course, and Islam, and that's just not been my style in making videos. I always try to stick to facts and stay away from all that personal stuff. And one of the interesting things I think about the whole GamerGate thing, having covered the whole Islam issue in my last couple of videos, I think it's interesting that some of the same people who are willing to smear all of the Muslim religion with the, some people in that movement who are extremists and misogynists and do and say things that aren't representative of other people who are Muslims, that those same people in the GamerGate situation, they're saying, oh, but don't associate me with the misogynists who are making these threats and saying these nasty things to, the women who are claiming their sexism in videos like Anita Sarkeesian. I don't mind people who try to rebut her arguments and show that she's not very academic, or that some of her claims don't make logical sense. And one of her claims about the connection between sexism in videos and sexism in society, that it causes sexism in society. I don't really see the connection between what happens in video games. And I think it goes the other way, if anything, that video games reflect society, just like films reflect society. And that's the second clip I want to show from Anita Sarkeesian's interview with Melissa Harris Perry, where Melissa Harris Perry basically asks her, are you going to say, are you going to support people who say the video game made me do it? And Anita Sarkeesian says, well, it's not a one-on-one thing, but I do think that that media matters and it shapes us. But then you'll see she totally turns around by the end of her answer there and actually is saying that it's more a reflection of our society, which is my point that I'll make again after I show you that last Anita Sarkeesian clip here.
Final question. So many times when bad things do happen, you will hear this kind of low level, the games made me do it. How do we do a reasonable, smart pop culture critique without just turning into the games made me do it in terms of violence?
Right. Yeah, you know, I am definitely not advocating that there's a one-to-one correlation at all, but I do this work because I think that media matters, right? I think that the media helps to shape our attitudes and beliefs and value systems. And so what does it say about, our society when the primary means of conflict resolution in most of these major games are about violence?
Anita?
What it says is we live in a violent society, and our video games and our films and all of our media are going to reflect the violence of our society. I mean, it's not that society wasn't violent in the past, but our media is even more hyper-focused on violence than it used to be, and we allow our media to show a lot more violent things than we used to. And anyway, so like I said, I'm trying to take sort of a middle ground in that I certainly don't agree that sexism in video games or sexism in film causes sexism in society, or that video games cause people to become violent against women, or all that I don't buy. But the argument that there is sexism in video games and it's a reflection of sexism in society, and I have a lot of problems with the anti-feminists who won't accept the mainstream long-term feminist idea that there have been subjugation of women. I mean, women just got the right to vote in the 1920s in the United States, and it's also in that same time period when women have been allowed to own property, and they still don't have equity in a lot of professions. They're getting closer, but there's still a lot of sexism in society, and being for equality for women, it also has to do with like the structure. People I've seen, I think I saw another Thunderfoot video where he said that the reason that women don't have pay equity is because they make decisions to take care of kids or whatever in their careers. They make different career decisions, but of course the whole system is set up so that people who make those decisions have to give up a certain amount of income and have to give up their career because childcare isn't built into the system. This is something I'm very sensitive to because I decided to become a stay-at-home dad. I was a public defender, which is one of the most low-paid types of attorneys, and my wife is an OBGYN physician, so if you were making an economic decision about who should stay home to be the stay-at-home parent, it obviously economically made sense for me to do that, and I don't regret that, but I do have a special sensitivity, having gone through that experience of all the people who saw me with my daughter going to the supermarket and said, "Oh, you babysitting for the day?" I don't know, I can't tell you how many times I got that comment or similar comments or various different ways that it was obvious to me that our entire society is structured with the assumption that women are going to take care of children, and that if you're going to say, oh well, that's a good reason for there to be pay inequity, then you're not seeing the violence inherent in the system, or whatever it is from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, or no, you're not. There's definitely sexism built into the system, and that part I am sorry if that's going to disappoint some of my viewers, but that's the truth. And the final feminist clip I want to show you isn't from Anita Sarkeesian, but it's from someone making the more mainstream argument about feminism. It's Senator Kirsten Gillibrand over on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, where he asks about the word feminism and then what feminism really is over in this clip.
Do it. What do you think feminism means today? Because I don't think people even know what the definition is anymore. I'm not sure I do.
Well, a lot of people don't like the word feminism. If you asked a young woman, are you a feminist? She might tell you, no, I don't burn bras and I like men. So there's a disconnect between...
There's got to be a middle ground between hating men and...
Yes, right. But all feminism is, it means you strive for equality and opportunity for all. So if you ask a young woman, do you believe in opportunity and equality for all? They'll say, of course I do.
Right.
So it's just a word. And if you don't like the word, we don't have to use it. The other word that I talk about in my book is ambition. If you show a picture of a man and say this is an ambitious man, the viewer will say, oh, he's strong, he's tough, he's a good decision maker. You show a picture of a woman and you say this is an ambitious woman, they'll say, oh, she's cold, she's calculating, she's self-centered. So the word is something we don't like. But if you ask any parent, do you want your girls to dream big and try hard to achieve their dreams? Everyone says yes.
And also...
So I think that I can agree with not having been able to agree with Kirsten Gillibrand, not having been able to agree with Anita Sarkeesian in total. I think I can much more readily agree with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, even the part about, the whole ambition thing, even though that sounds like the whole "Don't Be Bossy" campaign, and I saw a lot of people criticizing that. But I have a daughter who's in school, and I know that there are gender stereotypes about how women are supposed to be, more reserved, and boys get a lot more leeway to be boisterous in the school setting, and there are still a lot of gender stereotypes that are a weight on people, and it's not just male, female. I'm planning in the next few weeks to make a video on the whole idea of transgender and new gender expansion concepts that I've been learning about from some seminars I've gone, or a seminar I went to, and then some work I've done with the ACLU recently. But that's a whole other issue that I'm not going to get to now, but it does sort of transition into the next issue in alphabetical order, gays, or more specifically, the news from the Catholic Church this week. They had, I think it's called a synod, where the more liberal Pope is supposedly going to lead the way to a more accepting Catholic Church for LGBT people. And before, there's an interview between George Stephanopoulos and New York Cardinal Timothy Dolan. But before I get to that, here's the news report from ABC reporter David Wright on what I had actually heard was like this big movement forward by the Catholic Church. But when you get to the details here, it seems like they actually watered down a lot of the language so that it wouldn't be too pro-gay. Over in the report you can see in this clip.
For a pope who is struggling to welcome back what he calls the lost sheep of his flock, the report from the Synod of Bishops may be a setback, but it's not an outright defeat.
I think it's already had an impact to Catholics around the world.
Gays and lesbians and Catholics who've been divorced and remarried were hoping for more, based on the open, accepting language of a previous draft. For instance, the early draft said homosexuals have gifts and qualities to offer the Christian community, and recognized that same-sex couples offer each other precious support. That language was stripped out of the final document, which now reaffirms the Church's opposition to same-sex marriage. The final version of paragraph 55 does say men and women with homosexual tendencies must be welcomed with respect and delicacy, and says discrimination against gays is to be avoided. But even that much was controversial. The Vatican took the unusual step of revealing the vote count for every paragraph.
In the name of transparency, we wanted you to see everything and to show that we still have a way to go. We're still on a journey together.
Paragraph 55 was one of three that fell short of the two-thirds majority ordinarily required. The other two dealt with whether Catholics who have divorced and remarried should be allowed to take communion. But all three items got a simple majority and remain part of the working document and the ongoing conversation. Pope Francis, who had encouraged the bishops to speak freely during this extraordinary two-week synod, got a standing ovation in the end.
Even if not all the bishops are on his page right now, I think that over time, he's going to gain support.
1 year from now, the synod will reconvene. And next time, there may be a lot more bishops appointed by Pope Francis. For This Week, David.
So yeah, that's the report from ABC's David Wright, where you can see that they actually took some pro-gay language out of this big possible progressive movement in the Catholic Church. And over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos himself had Cardinal Timothy Dolan on, like I said before, and confronted him about why this language was taken out. You know, what were the arguments against this language? And you can see the Cardinal blames it on, basically on the Catholics in Africa, and this kind of supports what I was saying about Islam in the last couple of weeks, about how it's more a cultural, historical problem of some of the African regions, because there are also some really conservative, anti-gay, anti-woman views with the African Catholics, apparently. Well, anyway, here you can see Cardinal Timothy Dolan blame the taking out the too pro-Catholic language on African Catholics over in this clip.
That's so well. These debates are so emotional. Try and take us inside and give us a feel for what this debate is like. David pointed out in his piece that some of the language taken out of this document, one sentence was that homosexuals have gifts and qualities to offer the Christian community. Also that same-sex couples offer each other, quote, precious support. Those phrases taken out. Give us a feel for what the argument against phrases like that sounds like.
Well, you know where the argument or the conversation would have taken place, George, would have been in what we call the circules minores. Pardon the Latin language. This is one of the few places in the world you can still use it. In those small groups, which is about 20, 25 people who share the same language, lay people, priests, sisters, bishops, that's where we offered some amendments. I can only speak about my group, and there was a pretty good vivid conversation, especially with the African bishops, whom I love more than ever, who obviously come from cultures and societies that I admire, that have a very strong definition of marriage as man and woman with children, and are kind of afraid of attempts to water that down. One of the fears that they would have would be what we would call same-sex marriage. So they were pastorally sensitive about a document giving any indication that the church might be open to any change at all in the definition of marriage. So there was a good debate. There was a good conversation that went on. Once again, you got overwhelming agreement on things. First of all, on the definition of marriage given us by God and faithfully handed on by the church. One man, one woman, lifelong, life-giving, faithful, bringing about new life and children. All right? Their enthusiastic response to that. And then the other side, George, was how can we, though, embrace and never alienate those who are unable to live up to that noble ideal? And as usual, Pope Francis is saying, we got to keep both those values in mind.
So where?
So I think it's pretty clear from that answer that Cardinal Timothy Dolan is blaming the lack of some of that pro-gay language on the African Catholics, the bishops are from the African nations, and I don't know if I buy his justification for their position. It doesn't really seem that strong to me, and I do think, though, it strengthens the argument I made in the last couple weeks about how some of the conservative, anti-gay and misogynist views that you see in some of these Muslim countries are actually more regional and historical and cultural, and don't necessarily come from the Muslim religion. So I wanted to show you that. And speaking of some of the problems in that area, the last 4 clips I want to show you are on an issue that was like the overwhelming topic for several weeks in a row and seems to have shrunk down a lot in the coverage this week. The ongoing military conflict between the United States and some coalition allies against the Islamic State, or what they were calling ISIS or ISIL, in Iraq and Syria, and that's still ongoing. And I want to start with a news report. There was some coverage on the Sunday morning shows, and so I want to show the best news report I thought from the 5 shows this morning came from Holly Williams on CBS's Face the Nation. She's in a city in northern Iraq talking about how there's been some successes with the U.S. airstrikes, but some places it hasn't worked so well. And basically, it's worked where there have been some ground troops, where the Kurdish forces have been there to capitalize on the airstrikes, but not so much in the other areas. And you can see that explained over in this clip.
It's now clear that US-led airstrikes in Iraq and Syria have had a bigger impact in some areas than in others. 80% of Iraq's Anbar province is under the control of ISIS militants. And this week, the Islamic extremists seized another Iraqi military base. They also infiltrated nearby Baghdad to set off a string of deadly car bombs. But here in northern Iraq, the US has coordinated airstrikes with local Kurdish fighters known as the Peshmerga. And we've seen firsthand how those strikes have helped the Peshmerga push ISIS out of towns and villages. Now, the US Central Command insists that its primary focus is restoring security in Iraq. But over the last week, there have been just over 20 airstrikes here in Iraq, while around the Syrian town of Kobani, ISIS militants have been hit by more than 70 strikes, the most intense barrage since the air campaign began. Pentagon officials say an influx of ISIS fighters into that area created a target of opportunity. But the battle for the town of Kobani, which lies in a key strategic position on Syria's border with Turkey, has also become a very public test of whether US-led airstrikes can effectively halt the advance of ISIS militants.
That's our...
So that was the report from Holly Williams talking about the uneven, the airstrikes by the United States have had uneven results, that some places work, some places it hasn't. And so I want to show a couple clips of Ted Cruz over on CNN's State of the Union with Candy Crowley talking about ISIS and bombing and how well bombing works. And you can see Candy Crowley basically asks him a question with the premise of what was reported by Holly Williams on CBS's Face the Nation, that there have been uneven results from bombing. And she specifically asked Senator Ted Cruz about his statement that we should bomb them back into the Stone Age, which I kind of enjoyed, and you can see that over in this clip.
About the U.S.-led air assault against ISIS. There have been some successes from what we're learning. There have been some setbacks. In the end, you made a quote, a famous quote recently, we ought to bomb them, meaning ISIS, back to the Stone Age. It does not appear that bombing alone is going to make that happen, that ISIS will not disappear with a U.S.-led air assault. That being the case, where do you see the role, if any, of U.S. military personnel?
Well, unfortunately, the approach of the Obama administration to ISIS has been fundamentally unserious. We have dropped a bomb here, a missile there, but it has been really a photo op foreign policy. What we need is a concentrated, directed military objective to take ISIS out. Now, what does that entail? Number one, it entails a far more vigorous air campaign than we're seeing. You know, we're dropping a fraction of the ordnance that we have in other campaigns such as Afghanistan.
But should it eventually...
And actually, I'm going to show the next clip is the next question Candy Crowley asked, basically about how the airstrikes aren't working in some places where you need ground troops, and tries to get Ted Cruz to come out in favor of ground troops. And it's kind of interesting, he won't come out in favor of U.S. ground troops, and he kind of relies on the success of the Kurds and says we should rely on the Kurdish Peshmerga. And you can see that over in this clip.
Now. And what I'm getting at, I guess, is if the air assault won't work, Senator, where do you stand on the idea of putting perhaps more U.S. personnel in there as advisors, or are those who scope out places for the air assaults to target?
Well, Candy, that's what I'm trying to answer by saying we have a tremendous asset on the ground right now, which is the Kurds. The Peshmerga have been strong allies of the U.S. They are effective fighters, and they desperately need weaponry and assistance. And for whatever reason, the Obama administration, number one, has been delaying aiding the Peshmerga, has been running it all through Baghdad instead of aiding them directly, has been blocking them from selling oil, which doesn't make sense either. And at the same time, the Obama administration keeps focusing on Syrian rebels, many of whom have far too close ties to radical Islamic terrorists for it to make any sense for us to be supporting them. The Kurds are allies and they are boots on the ground. And when we work with them in concert, they're ready to fight on the front line along with serious air power. That's what we ought to be doing. And if it were a military objective to take ISIS out, I think that's what we would be doing.
So if anyone is looking for evidence that Senator Ted Cruz is running for president in 2016, I think his refusal to commit to putting U.S. ground troops into Iraq or Syria is good evidence that he is running for president, because that keeps him from having to explain to the isolationist or non-interventionist, depending on your position on them, that wing of the Republican Party, the kind of Rand Paul wing. He doesn't have to explain to them why he wants to put U.S. ground troops back in Syria or back in Iraq or into Syria. He can say we're going to bomb them back into the Stone Age and use the Kurdish Peshmerga. So that sounded like the makings of a presidential campaign to me. That's why I wanted to show that clip. And then the final clip I want to show of the night is kind of on the whole ISIS issue, but it's Representative Barbara Lee was over on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, and he kind of gave her bragging rights for being the only member of Congress to vote against going to war in Afghanistan. The original authorization for use of military force that was passed like in September 2001, within like 10 days of September 11th. I can't even remember the exact date, but anyway, and it's really broad, and it ended up being in the Supreme Court, it was the authorization for torture, it was the authorization for holding people without charges or trial in Guantanamo, it's still kind of the authorization for the bombing in Syria, and so it ended up being really way too broad, and I don't know if that's actually why Barbara Lee said she wouldn't vote for it back then, but that's she's taken credit for it now, and I guess she deserves those bragging rights, so I'm going to let her brag about it a little over on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, and the final clip for the show tonight over here.
Involved with. Let's talk about the fact that this lady, the only person to vote against us going into Afghanistan, that vote looks less crazy all the time, doesn't it?
Well, Bill, that resolution was a blank check, and it set the stage for perpetual war. And that blank check has been used over 30 times now to use in Yemen, Somalia, in terms of domestic surveillance, Guantanamo, you just name it. Congressional Research Service did a study for us and laid out the unclassified times that it's been used. And so I'm trying to repeal it, and believe you me, I have Republican support now, and I have about 150 members who have voted to repeal that resolution.
I wonder how...
So I'm not as far to the left as Representative Barbara Lee, I have to say, but that answer as to why the authorization for use of military force from September 2001 was too broad, I can't disagree with it. One thing she said there, and it definitely does need to be repealed, and I guess she does deserve to have bragging rights on that, and that's the last clip I want to show you tonight. I'm way over time. I was supposed to finish this up by 8 for dinner, so I'm not going to have much time to go into the comments. I have been reading them as I go along. I referred to them along the way, and I really appreciate it. I had over 200 people watching, although at one point, I noticed I'm down to like 140 something now. Started dropping precipitously after I stopped talking about GamerGate, which in a way is kind of depressing, but for those of you who are left over, I appreciate you watching the show all the way through, and also, those of you who have donated to support the Liberal Viewer channel by direct donation, I'm going to have, if you look up here in the corner here, you can see that there's a little eye where you can support Liberal Viewer, and because I have continued getting support over the last couple weeks, I'm only going to put the ads every half hour instead of every 15 minutes on the recorded version of this video, and I appreciate those who are donating that way. It makes it easier for me to keep making these videos for you every Sunday. Keep watching every Sunday. Liberal Viewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup is at 6:30 p.m. Pacific. I almost started on time, within 6 or 7 minutes at least today, so I'm going to try to do better on that, especially as we get into the political season. We're only like a couple weeks away from the November elections, so I'll try to have a good show for you on that next week. And like I said, thanks to you who joined me live or who are watching as a recorded show, and let me know what you think about the clips I picked out from you in the comment section, and what you think about what the corporate media here in the United States focused on. I hope I left you a little more informed about that to end your weekend or start your week or whenever you're watching this, and I guess I'll be seeing you all around the internet.